I'm presenting on cultural competence by design. So just to get started, in May of 2021, the Spanish postal system released a series of stamps called the Equality Stamps in commemoration of the 1-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd. This series of stamps was intended to bring attention to racial inequality. And what they did was to select some colors that aligned with certain skin tones. But what they did was to assign monetary value to them, the highest monetary value assigned to the lightest skin tone, and then it decreased as the skin tones got darker. Of course, this created a huge controversy because what they were basically conveying is that people of lighter skin tones, there was greater value associated with them as opposed to people with darker skin tones. I believe this series of stamps went on sale on May 25th and it was pulled down on May 28th. Now, all I could think when I saw that headline and especially when I saw the image was, how did this make it out into the world? How did a team of designers come up with a concept? How was that concept? How did it make it to this final stage? How were these decisions made? And this was ultimately put out into the world when it was something that was so insensitive, something that was so offensive, something that actually even contradicted the whole intent of the series to begin with. So, and I'd like us all to kind of put ourselves in that position. Like, if we were part of that design team, what would we have done in that process? Now, I would like to think that most people, and most of us probably fall into one of these three categories in a scenario like this. Some people didn't know. Some people just didn't get how offensive and insensitive this was. Some people may have known, but they just didn't speak up. Whether that was because they felt like they weren't going to be listened to, or there would be some kind of repercussions for speaking up. Maybe they spoke up in the past in another environment or another scenario, and actually, they caught flack for it essentially, and they felt it's not worth it to do it again. And the last category of people I imagine in this scenario were some people who just didn't care. They may have seen it, they may have heard rumblings, they may have even had an instinct themselves that maybe something about this just isn't quite right, but they just didn't care. So ultimately it got out into the world. And now my belief is that most people fall into the first two categories here. People generally maybe just don't know. They didn't know what they didn't know until there was backlash. And then also the group of some people who did know, but just didn't speak up. It's my belief that in general, most people, as I said, fall into these first two categories, and most designers as well. I believe that we as designers are even drawn to do what we do, whether it's as a fashion designer, an interior designer, a product designer, a UX designer. We're drawn to do what we do because we care about the ultimate good of the people that we are designing for. And our wish is to serve them and to do good and not to do harm in what we're doing. Now, what would have been the real game changer in that scenario, it can be a game changer in design in general, is cultural competence. As you'll see here, it's defined as the ability to understand, appreciate, and interact with people from cultures or belief systems different from your own. Now, when we see culture, sometimes our minds go automatically to race and ethnicity, but what cultural competence is about is actually the larger breadth of the dimensions of humanity. So that includes gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, religion, age. It's about understanding the fullness of humanity and what we are and the different ways that we show up, and having that appreciation and bringing that into our work. Now, I believe that if cultural competence had been in play in that scenario with the series of stamps that we started with, that The people who didn't get it would have gotten it because they would have this understanding. They would be educated in ways that would tell them something about the message they were sending through their design was offensive and it was harmful. And in terms of the people who maybe knew but didn't speak up, in an environment where cultural competence is the norm, where it's expected, and therefore where conversations around culture and difference and identity actually happen, they would have been comfortable to raise their hands. They would have been comfortable to say, maybe we need to reevaluate this. And there could have been a broader discussion which would have kept it from getting out ultimately into the world. Now, as a diversity, equity, and inclusion professional and an interior designer, I have exposure to each of these worlds, and I ultimately see it. I feel like they can't possibly not overlap, because as designers, we are designing for people, and if we're doing it right, we're actually doing it with people. But I'll get to that too. So we can't ignore identity in what we do. Yet, the design process does not typically make space for that conversation along the way. Sometimes it will be an afterthought. Sometimes it will be an issue or a topic that comes up in maybe focus groups. But by then, it's usually too late in the process to make significant changes. So from my exposure to these different areas, I have decided that my goal is to help designers increase their cultural competence so they can create in ways that honor humanity. Now, in order to do that, for cultural competence to become more of the norm in design, and for it to be a factor that we as individual designers bring into how we approach our work, it's going to require three key factors: courage, commitment, and collective agreement. First, starting with courage, there's a lot about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and about talking about identity that honestly makes people uncomfortable. It's just the way it is. I go into many environments doing my DEI work where it hasn't been a topic of conversation in the past, and you can tell because people are reserved. They don't want to raise their hands. They're not sure what to say. I present to leaders all the time who have actually reached out saying they want to begin DEI initiatives within their organizations. But when it comes down to it, their motives aren't really as pure or as humanistic as they'd like to make it seem. They're actually coming from a place of fear. They are afraid of saying the wrong thing. They're afraid of asking the wrong question. And they are looking at it from a personal security standpoint. How do I make sure I don't put my foot in my mouth? That is not the angle that we need to approach this from. For many reasons. One being that in general, when delving into this topic of identity, it's not going to be uncomfortable. It's not going to be comfortable because it's, as I said, not a conversation we typically have. It can change and that can be corrected. But generally, a lot of people approach this topic with some kind of hesitation or fear. But there has to be some level of courage to go against that norm. Because if not, we can see things happening like that series of stamps coming out, products being created that actually do cause harm to people. And that's ultimately, like I said, not what we as designers want to do. So we have to have the courage to get beyond ourselves, get beyond our personal fear, and think of our motives and what we ultimately want to do professionally, and also the legacy we want to leave as designers. The second factor that goes into making cultural competence more of the norm is commitment. And this has to be a deep commitment, not something that's tied to a surface issue or someone just wanting to say, oh, I raise that flag and say I'm supportive of DEI and all of humanity. It means there has to be a deep commitment to try things, to engage in these conversations, and to keep at it. Because, like I said, this isn't necessarily the norm in every organization, in every environment, but it will only become that way if we keep at it. And if we get discouraged one time, or if we do put our foot in our mouths, because that is likely to happen too, that one instance cannot keep us from going back at it. There has to be a deep commitment. Um, when I think of commitment, I actually am reminded of a story a friend of mine told me, a friend who works in a global design firm. We had touched base back in the beginning of 2021, and she told me that her organization had put out a statement, like a lot of organizations did in the summer of 2020, following the murder of George Floyd, promoting racial justice, social justice, declaring that diversity, equity, and inclusion were important values to them. They had pages about their employee resource groups that they had stood up, so affinity groups among their workforce, and just, waving the flag saying that they were all for DEI. And I asked her, I was like, well, has anything changed internally? Like, in your day-to-day existence within this organization, has anything changed as a result of this proclamation of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and cultural competence being important? And she told me no. She said the extent of it was that there had been an agreement and a push to have images of people from more diverse backgrounds incorporated into their renderings. That was as far as they got. That's not commitment. That's not meaningful commitment. And that's not going to move the mark. That's not going to create the space for the conversations that need to happen to prevent harm from being done. And the third element here that also is, really tied to courage and commitment is coming to a collective agreement. This is about an agreement beyond just one individual or just one little team or one group within an organization saying, yes, cultural competence is important. We're going to do things differently. We're going to have a different dialogue. There has to be collective agreement among and throughout an organization, throughout a profession, a design profession, throughout the design industry, for this to really take root and to really be adopted in a meaningful way. I've worked with an organization that was actually, I coached them through incorporating diversity, equity, and inclusion into their values, their corporate values, to make sure that, number one, it was something they really believed. It was something that they believed that they could incorporate into the work that they did, into how they showed up for each other as individuals and colleagues, and also to make sure that those values were in alignment with everything else that they said that they proclaimed to be. And it was actually really encouraging to see that was the case for them. And they are now in the process of articulating actual agreements between each other as colleagues and as people. Agreements like, if someone does see, someone maybe hears something, hears another colleague use a term that's insensitive or not actually just accurate in general, they've made a commitment among themselves that if someone hears that they will raise their hand, they will bring that to that person's attention respectfully. And also, if you are the person who actually said that thing, that you will receive that feedback, that you will have the conversation, you will lean into it and ask, tell me more. And you will use that as a learning opportunity moving forward. So there has to be this collective agreement where whatever that looks like within your organization, even within your sphere of influence, that these topics about identity and about difference will be addressed. They won't be swept under the rug, which they've been doing forever, which we've been doing forever, and which is why design has caused harm in so many instances, quite honestly. Because as I said, there's usually that one contingent of people who sees that there's an issue, they just don't speak up. So there has to be a collective agreement among us as a profession to move forward and adopt cultural competence and say, this is going to be a part of how we show up. This is how we can evolve the practice of design. Now, I've talked about those few key components that are necessary to start really making that connection between cultural competence and design. So I want to walk through 6 habits of culturally competent designers so that we can start really thinking about what does it look like to be a designer who values cultural competence and who recognizes and acknowledges identity. The first habit is take accountability. So don't wait for someone else to catch an issue or assume that someone else will speak up. We have to take the onus on ourselves as individuals to be the one to raise our hands. If something doesn't seem right, if something we recognize could really just be flat out offensive, or something could be exclusive, like in some way, a product we're creating, an item that we've developed, is the way we've designed it just alienates some segment of the population. So we have to own that. We have to be willing to raise our hands. We have to be willing to say, I'm just going to bring it up. It may be the case that maybe others don't agree. It may be the case that the question then is, okay, so what do we do about it? And that means there's going to be some more work to do. But ultimately, all of that is worth it to make sure that this becomes a regular dialogue, and that ultimately maybe something can be caught before it gets out into the world and actually is harmful to people. Habit number 2 is to ask questions. One of the most powerful questions a group of designers can ask among themselves is, have we considered all perspectives? Now, this is important because it opens the door for a dialogue. It may be the case that all, as many perspectives as could be considered have been considered in the process, and that's great. But it could also be the case that there was maybe a couple of people who maybe had an objection or maybe had a different perspective or a different take or opinion on something that was being developed, and they didn't feel they had a space until this question was answered. It may also be the case that you do get to a point in your process and you look around and you say, wait a second, this process has maybe even gone a little too smoothly. We've all agreed on everything up to this point. Maybe we need to bring in other colleagues or put this in front of others beyond our group to get another set of eyes on it. Because maybe you all have become so, it could be the case that some groups just happen to identify similarly themselves, or just, they've gotten used to one way of doing things. So it can be powerful to ask that question. Have we considered all perspectives? And if necessary, bring other people into the conversation as well. Habit number 3 is to seek knowledge. Do your research to find out about different cultures. Once again, culture not just meaning race and ethnicity, also meaning gender, sexual orientation, religion, age, ability, etc. And it's important to include this here because we have to proactively do this. This should be something that as designers, we are naturally inclined to do anyway. And I say that because we design. We design things, spaces, items for people. And we can't just limit our curiosity to a specific demographic that we are doing one particular thing for. It is on us to broaden our perspectives as much as possible, whether that be through reading, through documentaries, through conversations that you make space for even among your colleagues. There has to be that intention to lead with curiosity. No one's ever going to know absolutely everything about every dimension of humanity, every possible background. But the idea here is that the more that you do learn, the more questions you will start to ask, the more things that may be going off on your radar when you see certain things, because you're like, oh wait, I just learned about this new perspective on that. Is that something new that we can bring into the conversation? And in doing this, it's really critical, as it's noted here, to look beyond what's fed to you. And that means just there are a lot of narratives out there in media, social media, in our news feeds that may be commonplace, but they're not the end all be all. There are narratives that we've developed on our own. I've heard the term bias come up with a couple of with the previous speakers as well. Bias is not a bad thing. It is a natural thing. We all have had experiences. We've all been taught a certain way in schools. We've all had our own specific, unique set of experiences that have molded our views of people of difference, of people of different backgrounds. The thing is that our own individual perspectives are, once again, not the end all be all. And we have to take it on ourselves to, once again, lead with curiosity, to want to get beyond what these narratives are that have been constructed in our own minds. Habit number 4 is to talk to customers. And this is another concept I've been hearing today. And I just want to reiterate, it's important to talk to customers early and often. Don't presume to know what is culturally meaningful to customers. You have to engage with them to find out. Now, this means from the very beginning, like, you get an idea of how a project is going to start. A client comes to you and says they have this particular thing they want built or created. And we get into our work of figuring out what that solution could look like, getting our background information. The key there is, from the very beginning, engage with the customers, not just the client, engage with the actual users who are going to be using whatever you're developing, you're creating. The power of doing this early on is that you're getting these insights from the beginning, so they don't become an afterthought that you have to work into things later down the road. It's not something that's going to be like a surprise when you're, maybe even at the prototyping phase, and it's like, oh man, we didn't think about that. And you have to start doing some rework. The idea is to start early and to engage with customers throughout the process, because it's one thing to start getting some idea and having conversations at the beginning. As designers, what we do is take that information and we start translating it into a solution, or in ways that we can incorporate it into the solution. But oftentimes we don't go back and validate that the way we've interpreted it is actually accurate. So we have to intentionally create those opportunities to have those conversations. And also, and I've heard humility earlier before as well, earlier in the previous talks, we have to have the humility to accept what those customers tell us if we have gotten it wrong, because it's ultimately not about us. We bring our creative genius to what we do, but if it is not resonating with the people who it is intended for, then we have missed the mark. We have to be willing to take that correction and to work further to make sure that what we're creating ultimately honors the people that we're creating with and for. And to that point, habit number 5 is to believe people. When people share their perspectives, believe them. Don't take it back and analyze it and say, well, I heard something different somewhere else, or I never knew that was even a thing, so I'm just going to brush it off. Or, yeah, they're saying it's important, but it conflicts with what my image was of what the final product is. If we are honestly living up to being culturally competent designers and honoring humanity in our work, we have to believe what people tell us. This also goes back to that point of being willing to go back and validate. Am I getting it right? Have we prioritized the right things? Are we representing this as you envisioned it, not just as I interpreted it or as I envisioned it? Honoring people is about believing them. And habit number 6 is to share experience, either your personal or professional experience. And now this can be challenging depending on your environment, and especially if it's something, these are new conversations to be had especially among maybe your team and among your colleagues. But there is such power in sharing stories and in sharing, just from our own real life experience about how impactful something was. Maybe sharing a story of something that we experienced, something we received that was just so off the mark. And being able to share what the actual impact of that was is very powerful. And maybe even sharing something that we saw somewhere else and making sure that, once again, it doesn't necessarily always have to tie exactly to what you're doing, but creating that space and getting in that rhythm and that mode of having these conversations can be really critical and open the doors for it to become more natural, because ultimately that's what we need to do. We need to make these conversations more natural and just a way a common way that we show up in evolving, as I've mentioned, what we do is design practice, making this the norm and making space for it in our process. I'm not saying we have to throw out our process as it stands and just, we're starting from scratch and developing something new. What I'm saying is we need to add this cultural competence lens on top of the existing process so that we can make space for this conversation about identity. And now, with all of those habits in mind and thinking about the importance of courage, commitment, and collective agreement, I'd like to just go back and kind of re-envision what the conversation could have been among that design team that came up with the postal stamp collection. I would like to think that if they were culturally competent, that a couple of things could have happened, that somebody could have raised their hand and said, all right, if we're talking about equality, even this is just from a simple standpoint, this isn't even necessarily in the depths of design, but if this is about equality, why can't the value of the stamps all be the same? If we are talking about ways to represent equality in general, are there maybe other paths we could have gone beyond skin tone? Because there is a lot that people associate with skin tone. There are many different ways that concept could have been reinterpreted. And I would like to believe that even if they got to the final product, as I showed it to you on the first slide, that in a culturally competent environment, somebody would have raised their hand and said, we've gotten this far and we feel like we fleshed this out, but I don't think it's going to land well. I think that this is something that is going to do more harm than good. It's going to be offensive. And it is not necessarily aligning with what our original intent was. And I'd like to think that we can all evolve our conversations and our teams and in environments that we're a part of to get to those same points, to bring these same issues to the table, to raise the questions before everything is out in the world and the harm has been done. So I'd like to just take a quick minute. You all don't have to answer. You don't have to share your answer even with anyone here or otherwise. But I'd just like you to just take a minute to think, what's one thing you'll do differently based on what you learned today? Whether it's asking a new question, maybe even looking more into cultural competence or adopting one of the habits. But all of this, incorporating cultural competence into what we do is going to require us to do things differently. And it's not going to happen like with the flip of a switch, but it's going to be about incremental change. And we can all start right from where we are. So I'd just like to challenge everybody to think of just one thing that they would do differently. Now we will be opening it up for Q&A, but I just wanted to share the concepts and everything that I shared today is actually part of my upcoming book, Design for Identity: How to Design Authentically for a Diverse World. This QR code will take you to a page where you can sign up for information about updates and when the pre-order window will open. But I do invite you to really explore this topic more, whether it's in my book or in other places, but this is a really critical conversation, and this is going to be a conversation that's necessary for our profession to stay relevant, for us to stay in touch with what's happening in the world, with the conversations that are happening everywhere. And it's on us to be proactive and really engage and be willing to have that courage and make those commitments to bring identity into the conversation and into the work that we do.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Gosh, so many amazing things have come out of that talk, even for me. And so I thank you so much for sharing. And your book is coming up spring 2023. And I just want to mention too that I think a lot of what you talked about is more so on the design side, but this applies to everybody in the workplace, including anyone in tech, if it's a developer or someone who's in the product side. These are all great tips that we all can use. And thank you so much for sharing today.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think Eric, you're with us right now to field some questions, right, Eric?
Yes, I am. Thank
Awesome.
you, Jessica, for all of that insight. This was a really engaging topic.
Thank you.
Got a few questions to get us started off here. The first one being is, how do we start making identity a topic of discussion in the design process?
Yes, and I think honestly, it has to just be something that we start doing. There have to be those courageous individuals who start raising the questions. If you don't feel like you alone are that person, maybe it's a conversation you start with a small group that you work with. But it has to be something that we just start. There's no right way to get started. And I really think that if more of us start bringing up the topic, that it will just start spreading. It needs to become part of the norm. We talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and so many different aspects now. It's like, all right, well, now let's back up all that walk, all the talk. Let's walk the walk. And a lot of organizations have already opened that door by making these statements about why these things are so important. Okay, well, now let's live those values in the day-to-day and how we work and how we engage with each other. And I also think that it needs to begin, this conversation needs to start in our education, not just in the profession. In our design programs, I will say it was definitely a gap in my design program, and it's been a gap in most people's education, design education overall, from what I have heard and experienced and engaging with many different colleagues. And that just can't be the case. And that is, to me, like the most fertile ground. Designers who are just new to the space, they're forming their own design philosophies, and they're really just starting to get their arms around what it means to be a designer. This topic needs to be part of that conversation.
Yeah, that's something I've heard from a few people about, that gap between education and coming into like the workforce, and it really needs to start at that earlier level. And I think another question that we've got on this is like, what is the most critical questions like we can ask our customers during the design process?
Yes, so I think, but I will say that the most courageous and I think impactful question is, what about your identity would you like to see represented in the final product? And just leaving it as open as that. Because I think that signals to people that, number one, you care, and you see them as an individual, or and not just customer A, customer B, et cetera, that you are really curious to find out, and that that can open the door to more dialogue about the ways to incorporate their identity into the product as well.
Awesome, thank you. We do have a couple questions coming in from the audience as well. One of them that really sticks out is, do you have any tactical questions you could offer up to open the cultural competence conversation?
I do, and actually that is the how-to part of my book. I've actually created what I call the Design for Identity Blueprint, which is actually applying that cultural competence lens I mentioned to the design process. And it is literally questions to ask throughout different phases of the design process. So one of them is that initial question up front about, what about your identity would you like to see incorporated into the process? And then there are questions that we would pose to customers, and then there are the questions that we as a team of designers should also ask among ourselves. And that could range from like, what perspectives or what relevant perspectives and experience among ourselves do we have that we can bring to this challenge or this issue or this product that we're creating. It could be, are there other people maybe we need to bring into this conversation to make sure that we are really connecting in a meaningful way with our customer, to make sure that we are creating something that is going to be meaningful to them. Creating opportunities throughout the design process, as I mentioned, to say, okay, we think we got it. Do we really have it? Who do we need to go back to validate? And then when we get that feedback, what's the best way for us as a team to incorporate this and to make these changes within the actual product itself, or the the space, the item, the system, the app that we're developing, what are the best ways that we can honor the customer's wishes, needs, and humanity, and also fulfill the practical functional aspects of whatever that is as well. So that's essentially probably the most impactful, I would say, chunk of my book is about that actual how-to.
Thank you. Our next question kind of ties into what you got into a little bit about, like validating and testing things. And this one is, do you have any recommendations for usability research and usability testing that respects DE&I principles?
I don't have anything that directly correlates the two, or says how to incorporate that into the typical kind of usability tests. But that would definitely be an area that I would encourage people to look into. It's funny to me because I've had exposure to, I actually got into consulting as an IT consultant. So I have that lens. I also have a lens through design thinking and product design. And, especially product design, I feel like there's a lot of talk about the importance of engaging with users and, keeping that top of mind. That's what we do. That's what drives what we do. But there's still a lot of designer ego, in my opinion, and that we keep in the process of, okay, we listened to you, but now I'm going to take it and run with it and do what I do. But that whole, the usability, that whole realm there, that is definitely a space for opportunity for more conversation about how to incorporate this topic into what we're doing.
Yeah, that's something I need to look into more on my end as well. I really appreciate that question coming up. I have a question coming in from Carmelina, actually, and it's that you mentioned talking to users and having a diverse group, but I would imagine it would also be important to have a diverse team of researchers or designers as well. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Oh, yes. That's actually part of what drove me to write the book in the first place. Because in my experience as a designer, like most spaces I go into, I'm the only person that looks like me. And it hit me one day, especially, even as a design student, I was like, wait a second. I was like, if all these people are designing for everyone and no one here identifies like I do, on what basis are they trying to figure out how to design for me? Or why do they think that they can create something that's going to honor me if they don't know me and my voice is not in the space? So that goes back to a whole issue with the lack of diversity in general in design, which is something that also does need to be addressed. But, and I know a lot of conversations, especially around DI in general, go right to recruiting. Which I'll always say, yes, we do need to make more space at the table for people of different backgrounds, but opening the door is not the same as having an environment where they want to stay and where they'll thrive and where they'll be listened to. So there's a lot of efforts that need to happen kind of in parallel to make that happen. And also part of the reason I want to get this conversation started as well is that so it does become the norm, and so that those people in the spaces now, although there is, as I mentioned, like very little diversity in general in design, what we can do by starting to ask the questions is make a space for the people who are there to use their voice, to feel that they are valued, to feel that, yes, my lived experience matters, and that I am welcome to bring that into the conversation in the design process itself as well. So there's a lot of different things that need to happen, but in the meantime, what we can do for where we are is to start having the conversation. And I think honestly, if we start doing that and it becomes more of a norm, that might actually attract more people of different backgrounds to say, oh, there is a space for me here. There is something I can contribute. This is a space where I may not see a lot of people who look like me, but maybe I will actually be seen if I make that step and I get into the profession myself.
Thank you so much for that. Are there any other questions that are coming through? Or Carmelina, do you have any other questions that you're seeing?
Yeah, I think we just had one other kind of comment, and Chandriana was saying that really resonated with her because she's seen quite a few posts in LinkedIn stating recruiting is just the first part of it, right? And then continuous work needs to be done to make and keep a safe space for diverse talent to thrive and professionally move up in. So just this thought about, just saying it in recruiting is one thing, but actually doing it and keeping it up as kind of as we grow in this new environment, I think is the harder part. Wouldn't you say, Jessica?
It definitely is. And especially if, and I hear all kinds of arguments in my engagement with leaders just about, well, we tried to do more recruiting, but there just doesn't seem to be, there's no diverse talent out there. First of all, diverse talent, to call it that. There are plenty of people of different backgrounds who are talented, who are capable, who are there. You just may not be looking in the right places. So that, that's one of the excuses. There's no pipeline. How can we build the pipeline? Yes, there can be work done there as well. I think even starting as young as high school and exposing especially students of diverse backgrounds to design is an option for a career. I think that's one of the most fundamental places to start. So they have that exposure, so that can be design in whatever capacity, tech in whatever capacity can be presented as something that's actually a real tangible thing. It's a real viable option and a path for them to pursue. But it all, there still has to be that work that is done to make a space that is inclusive and that makes people want to stay once they're in the door. That's critical.
That's a great point, Jessica. And the other thing I wanted to mention too is I have in my coaching practice, I have so many clients that will not talk to any companies if they don't think that they're diverse. So on the flip side, can you talk a little bit more about that as well from that perspective, please?
Yeah, and it's funny because even in my organization, we were recruiting recently, and I was actually encouraged to hear the candidates ask, what are you actually doing here? What are you doing about the work? You say it's important. And how diverse is your workforce? I think it's a valid question to ask. I think that the way things are right now, we have to be not surprised that there's probably little diversity in most of the places, that if they'll own up to it and actually tell you that, that is likely the case. But this goes back, unfortunately, I say unfortunately because I feel the burden of this too, that it's often on people of different backgrounds. And I'm not just saying, just me speaking as a Black person, as a woman, but for us, sometimes we just have to keep getting into those spaces where there aren't a lot of people like us. Going back to that point about courage and commitment, it's an emotional, there is an emotional tax. Even showing up as somebody with a different ability.
Yeah, sure.
And people, and I want to go back to the range of what we're talking about what is diversity and what is difference. But there we have to have that commitment to show up and to really engage and to stay there, and sometimes maybe even just to do that, to be the example for other people to come behind us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Cecilia is mentioning that it's only 3% at a senior leadership level. And I'm curious, are there mandates out there? Because I know in government there are mandates, but I'm just curious, what are your thoughts on mandates? That doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be culturally diverse in the environment if they're just hiring these people, but please tell me more about those mandates, if any.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard something, well, back in the day, it was quotas and affirmative action. Now there are more, I hear a lot about diversity targets, is the newer way to spin it.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's all basically a bunch of talk until you actually make things happen. And to once again, going back to that concept of this, is this a genuine commitment? Is this something you really want to do? Anybody can say, we're going to strive to have this representation in our workforce by such and such a year. Okay. Even if you do, what levels are they going to be at? Is it going to remain that you go to your leadership page on your website and it's all, older white males? If that's the case, then what are you really doing? And there's a lot of controversy around that too, about, is that the best way is to are you just opening the doors for just anyone to come in? No, no one is just letting anyone come in. It just happens to be that they are, if they're doing it right, they are recruiting in spaces where people of different backgrounds are. The
Mhm.
people who are skilled, just as skilled as anybody else, maybe even more skilled, but they just, you haven't tapped into where they are as an
Yes.
organization. So there are many different aspects to it. It's not all on, well, we put an ad in such and such, with such and such organization, or we started recruiting at an HBCU. That's not the sole answer.
Thank you. And I just love the chat. It's just blowing up with this topic because it's just, I know it's so near and dear to all of us and trying to make things better. One question that came in, and then Eric, maybe you can look at the others that are longer. I'm not able to kind of read all of them right now, but one question came from Olivia Keys. She's asking which companies have successfully embraced DEI and what do they do differently from other companies who just talk about it? Do you have are there places where we can find a list like that, or can you speak to that a little bit more?
That's something I'm actually trying to track down myself. And part of the reason I wanted to put the book out there is I'm hoping that it will actually start conversation for people to say, we're doing it great here. This is how we've done it. And we want to share that with everybody else. I have done as much reaching out as I could. I honestly have not found that one kind of star example. That doesn't mean they're not out there though as well.
Sure.
As I mentioned, I'm hoping that this book and me speaking in different places will just create more talk for this type of this conversation, so that those things can be brought to light. There are some educational programs I've highlighted in my book because I did want to also talk about the people, the individuals and the organizations that are getting it right, because there are some out there who are really dedicated to this, who are, actively trying to bring about change. But, like I said, I'm hoping that the conversation can start, so more of those can start coming to light, and we can all just start exchanging ideas and make this more of a norm.
Awesome. Eric, anything else?
Yeah, actually, a really interesting question came in from Chandriana, and it's, how do we fight the statement just because there is no visually diverse employees, but we have diverse thoughts? How do you navigate breaking that down to help them understand that that is essentially lip service?
That's going to that, leaning on that diversity of thought. Yeah, yes. That's another thing I encounter in many environments and conversations about DEI. It's something that I address it head on. Number one, well, a couple of things that came up in that, even in that statement, which are really important. Number one, all diversity is not visible, and I will definitely say that is a completely valid point. But that doesn't also mean that when we're talking about diversity, that we go to what I say is this safe space of diversity of thought. That's not the only thing we're talking about here. We all have diversity of thought. That's how we have any conversation any day. That's what we hear in meetings. That's what's happening right here. But that's not the diversity that people have died for. That's not the sole scope of what we're talking about. And to limit the scope of the conversation to diversity of thought is essentially neglecting all of these other ways and aspects that have been historically excluded and have resulted in people who have been denied, the safety, have been denied opportunity, have been denied security, and been denied opportunities to even grow in any way. So we can't skirt around what the breadth of diversity is that really needs to be tackled.
I have another question that kind of can tie into sort of figuring out, how is the company actually embracing diversity and equity in their workplace? And a question's from Alex, and it's, what questions can you ask to see if they are embracing those practices? And this is more coming from like an interview perspective, but just in general, I guess, as well.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think I would ask how often identity comes up in conversations. Is this something that you talk about, number one, among your workforce, and number two, which to me is like where the next step of DEI is talking about how it applies in the that you do. Is there any space created for those conversations? If so, like, to what extent? It's a valid question. I don't know that everyone will have necessarily the best answer. But I think that those are valid questions to ask. And I think that there's power in asking those questions, because I'm also, as a leader in a small organization, we need to be prepared to answer the questions that are coming up. And I think that tide is turning, where people want to see real proof that these values really matter. And it's beyond just being able to say, oh, well, we have a Black employees group, we have a working mothers group, we have a veterans group. It's beyond just having the group. How, as an organization, do you tap into that resource and bring their perspectives into the strategic planning of your company? That might be a valid question.
Mm-hmm.
How are you really bringing those voices into the conversation in a meaningful way that impacts the overall direction of the organization?
Yeah. And it's at that high level, Jessica, it's a great point there, right? Strategic planning and making sure that is being discussed at that leadership level, and then it will obviously come down into the rest of the organization. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jessica. This has been such a great talk. And Eric, thank you so much for fielding questions. You did a great job there as well. So yeah, so we're going to take our break, and we'll be back. I'm just going to share my screen quickly. Thank you so much. And just share the agenda for the rest of the day. So we are going to take a break. We're going to honor an hour and come back at 12 o'clock, and this is Pacific time. And I look forward to seeing all of you back then. Thanks, everyone.